Trying to find a more accurate way to describe the relationship between government and religion, I devised the term soft theocracy and defined it in 2008 as a state where church and government purposes coincide to garnish taxpayers' money and resources structurally through tax exemptions and functionally through grants and privileges. That's the title of my talk today, soft theocracy. I say the majority of countries in the world today are soft theocracies if you take strict secularism as the ideal form of government through which a state should be governed. The purpose of my paper today is to detail this argument. A technical legal definition of secularism is that a state is secular when its legal and judicial processes are out of institutional religious control, and two, they establish neither an official religion nor atheism. That is, on the second point, neither one religion nor atheism are officially recognised by the state as the official ideology of the state. Recently, James Kirk Wall of Chicago summarised the basic principle of what secular government is about. He said, "Secularism is very simple. No persecution or privileges, handouts, based on religious beliefs. It's not pro-atheism or anti-atheism. It's not pro-religion or anti-religion. It's about individual rights and liberties. It's about the law applying equally to everyone." An April 2015 decision of the Canadian Supreme Court spelt out this principle clearly. In a case concerning prayers in a local council, the court said, "This neutrality requires that the state neither favour nor hinder any particular belief, and the same holds true for non-belief. It requires that the state abstain from taking any position and thus avoiding adhering to a particular belief." This was a unanimous decision which, for the first time, to my knowledge, reiterated a lonely dissenting judgment by Justice Douglas some 45 years earlier in the 1970 Waltz case. Justice Douglas said, "One of the mandates of the First Amendment of the US Constitution is to promote a viable, pluralistic society and to keep government neutral, not only between sects, but also between believers and non-believers." I'll return to the Waltz case below. Should the Canadian case create a precedent followed by other courts, it could, a big capital C could, put paid to the various definitions of secularism favoured by religious and other conservative academics. For religious academics especially, their key intellectual error, as I've argued elsewhere, is to extract their data from their starting point, which is that all of law can be sourced to Christian principles and history. This is very easy to disprove, but nothing we will say will ever persuade them otherwise. Even the Australian Human Rights Commission has defined secularism as, quote, "a belief in no religious belief," which is very similar to what a Seventh-day Adventist said in 1987. He said secularism is government characterised by the lack of any apparent, overt, visible interest in God, the Bible, religion, or spiritual values. I suggest this reveals the inherent religious bias that has always been present in the Commission. The Humanist Society of Victoria was correct to point out that the Commission's position denies the principle of secularism. The problem the critics have is that the courts are secular, even though those courts, over centuries, have made many decisions unreasonably favouring religious interests. That's not enough for them. They want to use their religious freedom as grounds for exceptions and exemptions from legislation to impose their will on us. They believe Parliament should legislate to protect their religious sensibilities. The Canadian court decision in 2015 could be seen to be the very start of the formalisation of secularism as government neutrality. The Canadian government's decision to embrace voluntary euthanasia legislation following the Supreme Court's decision in favour of it on human rights reasoning is very heartening. As per the handout today, which is on the table over there, I suggest government can be characterised in four types according to the relationship between the institution of government and the institutions of religion and belief and atheism. It's simple. Theocracy at one extreme and atheist government at the other. The vast majority of democratic governments are in the middle, yet I suggest there are no purely secular governments. The most extreme theocracy is the Vatican, insofar as it can be called a state. The most extreme atheist state is North Korea. There are variations in other states that can be characterised as either theocratic or atheist. It's not all black and white. Iran is theocratic, but it holds elections. China is atheist, but it tolerates some religion. Cuba is atheist, but tolerates visits by the Pope. The most constitutionally secular country would be France, but it privileges religion through extensive funding of mainly Catholic schools. Modern democracy has only begun to disengage itself from the influence of religion since the 17th century. It is going to take more than some 400 years since Democrats got started on this project for democracy to evolve to the point where the institutions of government, religion and belief, and atheism are more clearly separated at all levels. I argue that without historical grants of land in the colonial period, tax-exempt bequests, and various donations from the faithful, financial grants from government, and taxpayers' money realised through tax exemptions, religious institutions wouldn't be the very large and influential organisations they are in Australia today. Our politics would be not so far skewed in their favour in policy terms, underwritten financially by tax exemptions, straight-out grants of money, and legislative privileges. For example, in 1825 in the colony of New South Wales, the government created the Church and Schools Land Corporation, through which the Church of England received 1/7 of the colony's surveyed land. The government later took most of it back, but the church was left with what became considerable swathes of real estate that made them very rich as time went by. Previously, in 1790, Governor Arthur Phillip gave the chaplain of the First Fleet, the Reverend Richard Johnson, 400 acres, which eventually became the Sydney suburb of Glebe. In fact, Glebe, derived from the Latin word, over the centuries came to mean church land. Our French friends allege the Catholic Church owns a whole arrondissement of Paris, a Parisian glebe. How much would a whole suburb of Paris be worth? Some years ago, I defined a church as an onshore tax haven subsidised by taxpayers to pursue the supernatural. In 2013, Robert Nola improved this definition by adding 3 words. A church is an onshore tax haven subsidised by taxpayers to pursue their penchant for the supernatural. This is a more precise definition that takes into account that what we taxpayers are subsidising is their peculiar supernatural predilections. Paradoxically, as they are getting richer, their congregations have been shrinking. This was noted by a despondent Melbourne Anglican, Christopher Akehurst, in a 2000 article in Quadrant. He cites a member of the Anglican congregation saying that we are cash rich and people poor, in making his arguments that churches in Victoria are closing everywhere, and it is likely the churches will go the way of suburban cinemas, centralised in one place to which the remaining faithful have to travel. But this major factor of government subsidy and support of religious organisations is one that is overlooked by nearly all academics working in the field of comparative politics especially. The wealth of religious institutions is accepted as face value as unremarkable. I say this naive omission of critical data and this acceptance of the status quo has meant that generations of university students have been misled. If the critical perspective I'm advocating were included, even as an alternative point of view, I say students would have a more accurate description of the relationship between government, religion and belief, and atheism. As ANU's Adele Chenoweth recently said, silence selects and categorises. Silence informs our discussions, media reports, literary representation, our justice system, and in turn, a nation's shared public history. Silence may lead us to inaccurately conclude that what is unspoken does not exist. Instead of talking about what I say is a state of soft theocracy, comparative politics textbooks use words like cooperation, assimilation, accommodation, and as we've heard, pragmatism, to describe the relationship between government and religion as if this relationship was reasonable and not at all problematic, just the natural order of things. This status quo is reproduced throughout the government, bureaucracy, academia, and the media, creating an ideological wall that blindsides students and citizens. But it is not accurate. Governments are contradicting the principle of secular government by supporting religions financially, symbolically, and by way of legislative privileges. As a trade-off, they support non-religious organisations as well by tax-exempt status. The description and analysis of the relationship between government, religion and belief, and atheism in mainstream academia and the media is inherently flawed. It accepts the current state of affairs as a given without explaining how it is contingent. I will now discuss that idea. In 1970, Frederick Wallace, a New York citizen, a Christian, brought a case to argue that it was unconstitutional for his taxes to be used to subsidise the non-payment of property rates by religious organisations. He lost. 7 conservative judges argued the exemptions did not violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The purpose of the exemptions was not to neither advance nor inhibit religion. No one particular church or religious group had been singled out to receive tax-exempt status. The exemption wasn't a direct subsidy. Tax exemptions created only minimal and remote involvement between church and state. The state's attitude to churches was, in fact, benevolent neutrality, as churches were, quote, deeply embedded in the fabric of national life. This last comment is a dead giveaway. These were conservative judges finding a form of words to protect religion. A dissenting judge, Justice Douglas, had another opinion, which I cited earlier, which stands as one of the first defining legal statements of secularism. Briefly, where Justice Douglas saw strict government neutrality between government, religion, and its alternatives as the sine qua non of the Constitution, the majority Waltz judges backed and filled to find excuses to allow the exemptions for religion. If they had reached the same conclusion as Justice Douglas, all their concerns would have melted away, as they were to do in the Canadian decision I cited earlier, 45 years later. But, interestingly, notwithstanding their argument about the exemption not establishing religion, there was another silver lining in this case that goes to my point about the contingent nature of the relationship, of the present relationship between government, religion and belief, and atheism. The conservative Waltz judges that allowed the tax exemption refused to hold, quote, that it is a constitutionally protected right and therefore immune from legislative repeal or even limitations. I suggest that proves my point, that tax privileges awarded by government to religion are not set in stone. If there was enough political will, they could be changed. Given this is so, there would be no constitutional way for the churches to argue that the removal of churches' tax-exempt status, for example, was unconstitutional. As we might expect, the principle of secularism ultimately underlies secular law. The various exceptions and exemptions allowed for religion are mostly a sellout from secular democratic principles. I want to turn my attention now to a man who anticipated all this 200 years ago, the 4th President of the United States, James Madison. The strictly secular perspective in modern history, I suggest, was first stated by James Madison in his documents known as the Detached Memoranda, written sometime between 1817 and 1832. The document was not discovered until 1946. It was preceded by his Memorial and Remonstrance against Religious Assessments of 1786. Someone took my glass of water. Could you be so kind? We'll have a slight commercial pause. I was saying that the document, Detached Memoranda, was not discovered until 1946. It was preceded by his Memorial and Remonstrance against Religious Assessments of 1786. What follows is a thumbnail sketch. Madison was born in 1751. He served as the 4th president from 1809 to 1817. He understood that in many European nations, before the colonisation of North America, the church had amassed as much as half of some nations' property, giving them huge wealth and influence. On the 250th anniversary of Madison's birth, Rob Boston wrote, "When a bill officially incorporating an Episcopal church in Washington, D.C. reached President James Madison's desk one day in February of 1811, he knew just what to do, reach for a veto pen." Madison was never one to tolerate any official ties between church and state. As he explained in a veto message to Congress, he rejected the church incorporation measure because it, quote, exceeds the rightful authority to which governments are limited by the essential distinction between civil and religious functions. Once a religious organisation could acquire unlimited, untaxed property as a charity approved by governments, the genie was out of the bottle. Madison said, "Do not many of these acts give this faculty of acquiring and holding property without limit, either as to time or as to amount? and must not bodies, perpetual in their existence, he means churches, and which may be always gaining without ever losing, speedily gain more than is useful, and in time more than is safe? Are there not already examples in the United States of ecclesiastical wealth equally beyond its object and the foresight of those who laid the foundation of it? Well, of course, exponential religious wealth is exactly what has happened since Madison's time. The institution of religion, in the United States especially, in its evangelical and Catholic expressions, in particular, has become a malevolent, theocratic force trying to impose its will internally and externally, underwritten by their tax-exempt wealth and their privileged tax positions. The more militant churches exist as a theocratic fifth column, using their immense taxpayer-subsidised wealth to pay lobbyists to try and influence government continuously. Our recent visitor from the US, Sean Faircloth, partly made this case in his 2012 book, Attack of the Theocrats, and did more so Jeff Charlotte's 2008, The Family, the secret fundamentalism at the heart of American power. Coming at the same history, but from the tell-all perspective of a US self-confessed Catholic activist, Dale Hudson's 2008 book, Onward Christian Soldiers, The Growing Political Power of Catholics and Evangelicals in the US, confirms the critical perspectives. Well, I've made the argument that a critique of religious wealth was there from the start of the formation of the United States government, the first expression outside Europe of the secular principle. I've discussed the general blindness to government's structural entanglement with religion. You could hardly find a more profound example of this entanglement than the photo I have behind me today. Elevated members of the judiciary lined up outside St Mary's Catholic Cathedral in Sydney to receive what the Catholic News of February 2016 described as, quote, divine guidance for the year ahead, unquote, at the annual celebration of the so-called, quote, Red Mass. When senior members of the legal profession who administer secular law, not canon law, line up for God's blessing of their work, you have to ask whether they know anything at all about separation of church and state, and where does that leave us? So, in the time available, I'll just mention some of the entanglements between, could you bring up that paper? Thank you. Entanglements between church and state in Australia. I'll just whip through these examples. There is no section, I'll start with federal government. In addition to the Red Mass, Parliament opens with Christian prayers. The flag features 3 Christian crosses in the Union Jack. Christian holy days are celebrated as public holidays. In 1996, John Howard was elected Prime Minister, and the Northern Territory's voluntary euthanasia was overturned by the federal government following a private member's bill moved by a prominent Catholic member. In the Parliament on 20 October 1997, Senator Watson applauded the Governor-General, Sir William Dean, alleging that he had amended the national anthem to include the words, O God who made this ancient land, in a verse that is usually not sung. That was incorrect. You may recall that Australia adopted a secular national anthem, Advance Australia Fair, in 1984, and in 1997, Senator Watson alleged that Christian text had been officially added to the anthem. That was incorrect, as it turns out. But Christian verses are now regularly included in the national anthem sung in private religious schools against protocol. In 1999, an ABC radio transmitter in the Northern Territory was sold or leased to a British evangelical group, Christian Voice, who broadcast fundamentalist propaganda non-stop in several languages to South Asia from studios on the Sunshine Coast via satellite link to the transmitter. I have photographs of these state-of-the-art studios. In 2001, the tax office decided in a private ruling that a retired pastor could receive $1,000 per week paid to a church credit card for his personal use, plus the free use of church accommodation and a car, and all of that would be untaxed fringe benefits because he was, quote, religious. In 2001, Archbishop Peter Hollingworth was made Governor-General. On 29 May 2004, the inaugural National Day of Thanksgiving was launched with the Treasurer giving a speech in a church. On the website of the National Day of Thanksgiving, it was claimed, with the approval of the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition and the Governor-General, that Jesus Christ reigns over Australia. Exemptions were legislated for churches from industrial legislation, particularly the Catholic Church, allowing them to employ who they prefer and sack those who they don't like. In 2008, and this is really important, the High Court closed down an attempt to argue that $20 million plus of federal funding for the Pope's World Youth Day was unconstitutional, but by declaring the writ vexatious. To date, $700 million plus has been given to evangelical organisations to employ religious-only, mostly evangelical chaplains in public schools on the understanding they will not attempt to convert children to their faith, despite the fact that for most of these chaplains, proselytising and conversion is their central aim. When the funding was found to be unconstitutional on technical grounds, the government legislated to continue the funding. When the Australian National Charities Commission was created in 2012, an exemption was made so that churches are not required to report their wealth, unlike all other charities, a condition that does not apply in New Zealand or England. Okay, that's federal Australia, some examples. I'll give you some examples now from Australian states. There is no section in any state constitution which separates church and state. State constitutions were written between 1840 and 1859, and there's been no amendment, any attempt to separate church and state. It may not even be possible. All state parliaments, with the exception of the Australian Capital Territory, commence with Christian prayers. Upon election, all members of Parliament, at their swearing in, are obliged to acknowledge the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, in England, the Queen, as head of state and defender of the faith. In 1910, a Queensland referendum that I mentioned earlier removed the word secular from the Education Act, allowing religion to be taught in state schools by state teachers. This still applies in 2016. In 2005, New South Wales Reverend Dr. Gordon Moyes MLC announced he would sponsor a private members' bill in the state parliament to amend church property laws so that, quote, disaffected congregations who wanted to leave the uniting church could sue for ownership of the church building in which they worshipped. That is, the parliament was to be used to resolve a matter internal to a church. In 2006, the South Australian Labor government appointed Catholic Monsignor David Capo to executive committees of the government. Even the Murdoch press was taken aback. They wrote, the appointment of a non-elected, non-government person to cabinet, let alone a senior church figure, is unprecedented in Australia. I'm getting excited. Okay, in 2008, the New South Wales government funded the Pope's World Youth Day in Sydney to a sum somewhere in excess of $100 million. When the Sydney Morning Herald sought information about how much the government had paid under freedom of information laws, the government stonewalled and refused to give the information. Only Queensland and New South Wales have not decriminalised abortion. Christian holy days are celebrated as public holidays. When Archbishop Jensen retired as Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, both the Governor and the Premier attended his farewell as if this was some kind of government event. I think I've just got enough time to quickly whip through the situation across the ditch. New Zealand does not have a written constitution, and case law has not formalised separation of church and state. The national anthem, God Defend New Zealand, is in effect a Christian hymn. God Save the Queen is also a national anthem in New Zealand. Parliament opens with prayers and the flag contains the Union Jack with Christian crosses. Christian holidays are celebrated as public holidays. In 1975, the government legislated to fund religious, mainly Catholic schools. The legislation was introduced late at night before a parliament rose for an election. A report commissioned by the government from a private consultancy, which argued against funding religious schools, was never released. We only know its contents, arguing against government subsidy as it was leaked to a public school activist. In 1985, an Anglican Archbishop, Sir Paul Reeves, was made Governor-General. After his appointment was announced, he said that he would, quote, fulfil his clerical vocation in the position. In 2011, the High Court found that an interest-free mortgage scheme run by an organisation set up by an evangelical group, described by the Charities Commission as a pyramid scheme, was found to be legal because it advanced religion. The Charities Commission in Wellington does have the wealth reporting requirement. The Church has declared $11 billion in assets in 2012. The Catholic Diocese of Auckland was the wealthiest in the country with $695 million. Churches, including the Salvation Army, are sitting on significant sums in the bank, while it was recently argued a quarter of New Zealand's children are living in poverty. The Salvation Army, we found, had $37 million in the bank in 2012. The Parliament passed legislation to allow charter schools in New Zealand, enhancing private religious education at the expense of support for public education. In 2013, a constitutional advisory panel published a report concerning a constitution for New Zealand which selectively omitted any mention of separation of church and state. But in our NZRH survey of March 2016, the survey found that 56% of citizens supported separation, only 15% were opposed, and a huge 29% had no opinion. An exception to all this in New Zealand, which we don't have here, is that in 2013, the Parliament voted to legalise gay marriage. I might leave it there, and if you have any questions, we might just have time for a couple of questions before the transition to John Bell. Thank you.